Hello, everyone. This is Victoria Mattingly, and I'd like to welcome you to the SIOP Conversation Series podcast, where we talk with leading industrial organizational psychologists. This is episode 37, and we'll be talking about science for a learning workplace. Today, our guest will bring fresh perspectives on training and development from a self-regulation and skill acquisition perspective, with an emphasis on individual differences. Welcome to the SIOP Conversation Series, Eric Day.
Hello. Thank you, Victoria. This is cool. I appreciate having the opportunity to be with you guys today.
We're thrilled to have you. A little bit of background on Eric. Eric is an industrial organizational psychology professor at the University of Oklahoma. His research interests are personnel psychology and organizational behavior, including topics in personnel assessment, selection, training and development, leadership, and group dynamics. Much of his research involves the study of human performance and complex skill learning, with an emphasis on individual differences in ability and motivation, self-regulation, retention and transfer, and team-based training. He's published in a variety of peer-reviewed journal articles, including Human Factors, Human Performance, JAP, Journal of Experimental Psychology, Applied Organizational Behavior, Human Decision Processes, Journal of Management, and the list goes on and on. His research has also gained attention from the Wall Street Journal, NPR, and ABC News in 2020. Funding sponsors for his research have included the National Science Foundation, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, the National Highway Traffic and Safety Administration, and the U.S. Department of Defense. He currently serves on editorial boards for JAP, Human Performance, and Small Group Behavior. And I must say, the views and opinions expressed on today's conversation series are those of our guest and do not necessarily reflect the views of SIOP. Eric, we are so thrilled for you to join us here today.
Thank you. Me too.
So to start our conversation, we'd love to hear about your journey as an IO psychologist. How did you get involved in the field, and what spurred your interest in complex skill learning?
Well, I got interested in IO psychology based on a conversation with a faculty advisor. I was originally interested in psychology as an undergraduate at James Madison University, more from a clinical perspective. I was given the opportunity to kind of get a sense for what it might be like working with people in a clinical setting, and I realized that I couldn't handle it. It's too much for me. Probably didn't have the maturity for it. And then talking to my faculty advisor, she said, "You know what? Maybe IO psychology, this thing IO." And I was like, "What is that?" She explained it to me. This was at the end of my junior year. She said, "We have a new IO faculty member coming in from Bowling Green. I think you should work with her, sign up for her." She totally changed my schedule, had me take an undergraduate class in psychometrics. So that's what got me started. I pursued a terminal master's degree at University of Central Florida, had a great experience there, much more applied, wanted to learn more about research, was very fortunate to get into a PhD program at Texas A&M University. And I was excited there. I had the opportunity to work in a collaborative environment with an applied cognitive psychologist, Wayne Shabilsky, great mentor. And then folks in SIOP would know Winfred Arthur, an IO psychologist. They had a collaborative skill acquisition laboratory going, and just I don't know what happened. I think I just got lucky, and they showed an interest in me, and that got me going. Yeah. As far as skill acquisition or learning, what attracted me to that lab was an opportunity to do research on the learning process. Growing up, I was always, I don't know if it's fascinated or confused by, in a class, or if it's a coach teaching you how to do something, they would tell you, they would show you, and then I would notice a lot of variability in how people took that or understood it. So it was just at a very early age, it was like, okay, we were all just told the same thing. We were all just shown the same thing. How come not everybody is understanding it the same way? How come not everybody's doing it like it was demonstrated? So that, I think already at an early age, I was just intrigued by the individual differences. I didn't use that kind of language in my head, but just like, why is it that not everybody is getting this the same way?
Interesting. And based on your experience in learning development, what are a few key recommendations you have for employees and those out there trying to learn? And what are a few key considerations for employers trying to develop effective training? So, kind of both sides of the coin.
Yeah, well, I wanna start with just what's the foundation? What do we know? What have we known for decades? A lot of times, students, I'm assuming we have a lot of graduate students here with us today. When you're reading the latest scholarly literature, you're not seeing some of the foundation with things we already known, we've known for a long time. And so we get caught up right now in certain nuances. We're trying to figure out how to explain another 1 or 2% of the variance in an outcome of interest when we already know a great deal, but we just don't talk about it because it's sort of assumed that everybody knows that foundation. But let's just start with the foundation. Assuming that we're trying to teach people or get people to learn a skill. So if we're interested in some sort of a skill-based outcome, whether it's a cognitive skill or a behavioral skill, we know that it's important to, one, tell people what it is that you want them to do and explain why it's important. Show them some sort of demonstration. Here's what you want to do. Here's how to do it generally. Three, very important, active practice. You have to give it a go. You have to give people an opportunity to try. And you got to have feedback that lets you know what's going well and maybe where you need to focus and how to focus, what to focus on to get better. So from the employee perspective, I think it's important that you understand that process because you're going to, even if someone tells you and even if someone shows you, you think you got it, you really don't until you try doing it. You got to do it. You got to do it. And you're at the same time, you got to figure out how to get feedback. Sometimes that feedback, yeah, feedback seeking is the literature shows that's a good thing, leading to a lot of learning. We've seen that demonstrated in the literature. But you can't always be going to the boss, always asking, "Can you give me some feedback? Give me some feedback." That's a little too much. You have to figure out how to generate feedback for yourself, and sometimes that means some sort of putting yourself. I'm not in some sort of a testing where you're really going for it. You have a few things that you're looking for, and you're sort of keeping track of where you're getting better, where you're not getting better, and you got to figure out how to give yourself feedback and how to move forward. So that's something that I think is important to understand, both from a learner perspective as well as any organization. Any organization that's serious about really getting people, they're encouraging them to learn skills, whatever it is. Maybe it's a programming skill. I don't know. You're going to have those components there. You're going to have that again, telling them, showing them, active practice with feedback. I'm working with a graduate student right now. He's going full steam learning MATLAB, and MathWorks has a wonderful website that has tutorials where they're explaining things, they're showing you things, and they have little things for you to do, hands-on practice, active practice, and they give you feedback along the way. That's a great like online setup. It's not just simply telling them and showing them. The active practice and the feedback are critical.
And what I find interesting about this model is thinking about corporate training and learning and development. A lot of times it stays in that first phase. You know, you give employees information, maybe it's a webinar, maybe it's a, you know, in-person training, but it's all very, you know, passive, and here's the information, here's what you need to know. And rarely do we get to the showing phase, the practice phase, and very rarely the feedback phase. And so I feel like so much of this goes outside of the training environment.
Absolutely, yeah.
Mhm.
And if you, in an ideal setup, your supervisor, your colleagues, maybe the ones who are more senior, they know the things that you're working on, and you're given the opportunity to try those things in the workplace, and they know that you're giving it a try, and they're able to be there to give you feedback, um, guide you along the way if that's possible. An ideal environment, that's you got to have those opportunities to practice, not just in the training environment, but back in the work environment. And you got to have that feedback piece. And
Yeah.
again, sometimes you got to figure out this is the self-regulation piece. You got to figure out how to give yourself feedback.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm reflecting back on the time where I was at DDI, and one of the big findings at the time that we would be sharing out to our clients in our marketing materials was the criticality of manager support. And at the time, I just presumed that was okay. Well, you need to have your manager really on board with learning and development efforts. They need to, give you the time to do the trainings. They need to be supportive and give you opportunities to, practice and whatnot. But in this mindset, it's actually so much more than that. It's that manager, providing that feedback, being that coach, being that role model, really being intentional with the practice piece. And I feel like with managers, they tend to forget how critical their role is when it comes to skill development and skill acquisition.
Yeah, absolutely. And having colleagues, coworkers who serve as mentors for you, very important.
Yeah, I think now back to the work I do in the diversity, equity, inclusion space, and I talk a lot about inclusion is what we do, but people learn so much by watching what others
Yes.
do and seeing that those, as you said, the role models and the mentors and those live examples. But rarely do we get to the point of that practice and that feedback, especially around these more sensitive topics. And so
Right.
and I too have a pretty strong background in the learning and development space, but more on the soft skills side. And what I think is really interesting is whether it's soft skills, and I don't like that term. I like to call them power skills or people skills, but it's the same overall process, even though I would assume, there's a lot more tangible aspects to the more of these complex skill acquisitions. So I know I'm going a little bit off of our script here, but can you speak to some of the differences between like soft skill acquisition and more of like complex skill acquisition, or is it really the same overall?
I don't know if I don't know if I would say there's a distinction. So when I use the word complex, most of what we're learning these days is going to fall in that realm. And it's a matter of degree. So you can look at various taxonomies of complexity. The typical taxonomy will have a three component or three dimensions. One is just the sheer number of components or the sheer number of things one has to do. And then you have a coordinative complexity. Those things, the extent, how interdependent are they, and how do you have to coordinate them to do well? And then there's the dynamic complexity, and that's sort of the wild card X factor, and that's how much are things changing on you, how inconsistent is the environment that you're operating in. And so an interpersonal skill, to me, interpersonal skills are highly complex. There's a lot of elements to it. And there's certainly an intrapersonal component to interpersonal skills. They're very complex, absolutely. And there's a lot of dynamic. You can prepare yourself for a certain situation, and you may end up in a situation that you've never been in before. And you got to figure out how to adapt what you know, what you can do, and at the same time, figure out how well it went, give yourself some feedback, talk to others, and how might you handle it in the future. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And so moving from interpersonal skills to more technology. So technology-based training has given employees more control over their learning experience. And you've recently published some work talking about the concept of learner-controlled training. What does that mean exactly?
So I may end up rambling here a little bit, but I don't know if I make a huge distinction between learner controlled and let's say there's some sort of opposite. But if there were an opposite, we'll just go back to the old school, almost kind of a blue collar work environment, very a proceduralized learning environment or training environment where it's very clear. First, you do this, you do it like that, then you do this. It's a lot of hand holding, a lot of here's exactly how you do it. You're almost going back to scientific management kind of days. There's the one way to do it. We're going to train everybody to do it that way. We're going to reward them for doing it that way. And then as the world becomes more complex, the job environment becomes more complex, then we know that we can't just, not every job has a set of skills where you can just clearly show them first, this is how you do it. And so we need an environment where there's a little bit understanding that things are more dynamic. There's some flexibility, and it's thought that if you give learners a chance to have more control, they're going to be able to learn in a way where they're going to be more adaptive. So you can contrast that proceduralized learning environment with an open discovery environment where you just put people in the training, you just give them all the material, you let them do whatever. Late 1990s, early 2000s, we start to have something called active learning training, which is it's like a reconciliation between proceduralized and discovery based, where it's still more of a learner controlled environment. They get to dictate the pace, they get to dictate what they're going to focus on next. But we put elements in there to kind of help them do a better job of self-regulating. And that's I would say that's a way of thinking about a learner controlled environment where they get to dictate a little bit more, but there's still hopefully some support there for those elements that I was speaking to, particularly on that feedback component. The rambling part now starts where I've never, even in me personally, Eric Day, growing up, I might find myself in what looks like a highly proceduralized training. I got somebody who's really just, here's how you do it. You do it like, I'm asking questions right away, and I'm asking what if, how about so I've always been someone who's wanted a little bit more control, and I'll start just jumping in, asking questions in a way where I'm generating feedback. So what you're saying is first comes X, then comes Y, and here's the reason. And the instructor, the boss, the coach might say, no, Eric, it's more like, okay, I just learned something. And I wouldn't have learned that if I didn't take some control. So you tell students this all the time, whether it's undergraduate, graduate training, when I work with kids in sports, I'm always encouraging them, please ask questions. Please ask questions. Okay. You're going to learn when you ask questions. I drop my kids off at school. I tell them I love them, and I say, ask questions.
I love that advice. My husband, when he drops our kid off at school, he goes, "Make some friends today." And I think I think your advice is more practical.
Sometimes I add and be nice to people. Yeah.
Make some friends. He has lots of friends. So when it comes to learner controlled training, what implications does this have for the science and practice of training and development?
The way I look at it is, I think for the most part, human beings are irrational, and we're not even close to being rational. So that's where I come from. People can disagree with me on that. And part of that then means that I think the vast majority of human beings, I'm not saying I'm very good at it, just aren't really good at self-regulation. So the implication for employers, for organizations, is that if you're providing all these resources to your employees, all webinars, we're online tutorials, there are all this, it's great that we have all these opportunities now. Kids can learn how to do things. All of us can learn how to do things with YouTube videos. But don't just assume that just because the resources are there that people are going to be good at availing themselves of those resources, because people aren't always good about figuring out what do I need to try next. I'll call it exploring. What do I need to try that's different versus what do I need to just go with that's working right now. I call that more exploiting what you already know. People, there's a dynamic there. Those two things feed off of each other in terms of skill acquisition, in terms of learning. Times to explore more, try something different. When to exploit what you already know how to do, and how to spend the time in a way where you're not just highlighting things, you're not just outlining things, but you're actively engaging and trying to do something. That active practice, you're testing yourself, you're generating feedback. I would say the vast majority of human beings aren't very good at that. And so as much as all the resources might be there in these learner controlled environments, there's still, you can't just leave it up to the employee. You're going to have to still, spend some time with them in some way, making sure that they actually are developing.
Well, and it's interesting because, we live in a time of there's a glut of content. We don't need to be producing more content, more learning content. It's more of the instructors or the trainers or the teachers, or whoever, whoever is the facilitator of that learning environment. Their role is to ensure that there is, meaningful interaction with that content, that there is
Yeah.
opportunity for practice, that there is, feedback that is provided. And so I think it's this new, and I'm not, it's not incredibly new because we've been living in this world of excess content for quite some time, but it's a mindset shift of, oh, I'm going to just share all this information. It's like, no, your role is to actually help the learner engage with the
Yeah.
information in a way they're actually going to retain and utilize that learned skill after the fact.
Yes.
And so,
Yes.
yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah, there's so much out there. You could just be exploring and trying a bunch of new stuff. You think you're learning something, but you're really not until you really just go for it and try to do something with that. Yeah.
Yeah. I am curious, Eric. What's your take on AI and Chat GPT, and the implication these newer tools have on the learning process? Do you think that they're going to stunt, or they're going to build upon, what we've done in the past when it comes to learning and knowledge acquisition?
I think people need to figure out how to leverage it. I
Mhm.
think we can, people can be resistant to it. I've seen Terminator, and I am very, well, not very, but there's a part of me that's a bit worried that the technology is going to take over. But I think we need to learn how to embrace it. Whether I got a feeling the learners are embracing it. Now as instructors, how are you going to embrace it? But I think you can use Chat GPT as a way to, um, or AI as a way to engage material more meaningful. You can actually generate a question for yourself to answer it. Now ask the Chat GPT, see what it comes up with, compare,
Hmm.
contrast, see what's different, and then try to figure out, okay, so there's a difference here. Is the AI giving me something that's real, that's different, or not? And then now you got to then spend the time to figure out, what's how to resolve that difference. But at the same time, what can you do? What can you provide? How can you answer it in a way that the AI currently can't answer? So I think that's one of the ways as a learner. If I were in an environment where I was really trying to learn something and I had that resource, that's what I would use it for. I would use it as a way to test myself, test my knowledge, ask myself questions, and I don't have to have an instructor
Yeah.
now to give me feedback. I don't have to. Back in the day when I was an undergraduate, I'd have the the answers in the back of the book, or a
Mm.
practice guide or whatever. Or I had my friend Todd, who we would ask each other questions and reconcile whatever differences that we would have. I got this AI that I can work with. You have to understand there's going to be limitations to what it has, but from a learner perspective, I think it's a great opportunity for that active practice and to get feedback.
With the boundaries, or with the recommendations that you just shared, right? And I think this goes to a broader theme. What we've been talking about today is the difference between passive learning and active learning, and real learning needs to be active, and using Chat GPT as a way to get that feedback and kind of dig deeper in, and to challenge what it's even generating, because we know it's not always pulling
Yeah.
the most factual information. And so I love this concept of using it just as another tool to be able to get feedback, to be able to engage in active learning. I did want to make a quick call out to those who are tuning in live. You do have the opportunity to ask Dr. Day questions, and so feel free to put those in the chat, and we can potentially answer some of your questions. So if you have some burning questions at this time, please feel free to put those in the chat before our conversation comes to an end. In the meantime, I did want to go back to learner controlled learning, and that approach. And when it comes to training and development compared to more traditional approaches in training and development, how might organizations further benefit from taking a learner controlled approach?
I have to think about that one a little bit more. and I don't want to just repeat what I said before about you still got to make sure that they're engaging in the active practice. There's opportunities for feedback. And so I'm going back to that. So Victoria, I'm gonna have to ask you to ask me that question again in a different way, so I can one give myself time to think about it, but also
Yeah.
maybe if you say it a little bit differently, something will go off in my brain.
Yeah, I'll get it. I'll even get a little bit more refined. So, are there contexts in which an organization might choose a learner controlled approach compared to some more directive approach?
I'll start with when is the procedural. I think when
Yeah.
things are very clear cut, very straightforward. I would make an argument that a lot of times when safety is a concern, when it's
Mhm.
a prevention type of a focus, let's make sure there's certain things that we don't want to happen. I think then it can be very procedural and more procedural. And a lot of this stuff is a matter of degree. I don't like to think of it in terms of an either or. I think when you're dealing with a more open task, so your complex tasks, particularly when they're strong on that dynamic component, they're very open. It's hard to know what's the ceiling where that there's always somewhere to go. I think that's when maybe having a little bit more learner control makes sense, because I think that gives the learner a chance to go in a direction that maybe they feel is a little bit more right for them. They engage the learning process in a way that is more meaningful for them. That's going to make it a little bit easier for them, potentially to adapt to new but related circumstances. So I think you gotta. Those are some things to be thinking about. But I want to go back to, yeah. There's a lot of research out there on active learning. Learner control, those kinds of things. But I'll make this argument: the best kind of training would still be highly individualized. This is ideal. You're not going to get it, but I'm working with an expert. The expert's telling me, showing me, telling me what to work on next. They're giving me feedback. That's still going to be the best. So a learner controlled environment isn't going to be better than that, what I just said, where you're able to work with an expert. You got all this time. They're giving you things to work on. They're giving you feedback. That's just not realistic. It's not realistic. So a lot of times a move to a learner controlled environment is just simply because there's so much to learn. Things are very complex, and it's not feasible to give them all the guidance that we know would benefit them more probably.
Yeah, and we have some really interesting questions coming in from our audience. I'm going to put this one on the screen from Ian Smith. Would there be a good way to combine more procedural and learner controlled and a more universal design approach, individualized in nature yet prioritizing components?
That's a great question. I'm thinking of a few things for that. A lot of your adaptive training environments, I think that's what they're trying to do with these. I'll just say computer based approaches where it's very adaptive, where they're giving you content, they're giving you things to try, and then they give you something new to try based on what you just demonstrated, what you are able to do. They'll give you something more advanced, or they'll give you something that adds a little bit of something else to move you in that direction. That would be awesome. And there are people working on that. It's not a lot of IO psychologists who are working on that, but folks in other disciplines where then very adaptive training. And so you get the best of both worlds. You're given all that active practice, you're given that feedback, but you are taken in a direction that works for you and is giving you pretty good marks on any learning outcomes. But I would also just go back to thinking about that active learner kind of a paradigm where you're still giving people some control over their learning, but you're there to help them a little bit with their self-regulation, maybe asking them questions to ask them. So there's something in the environment where you're encouraging people to ask questions, where you're encouraging people to test themselves. You're encouraging, you somehow find a way to get them to explore more. I've learned in my research that you can't simply just tell people to try something new. You can't just tell people to explore more. They won't, they can't, I don't even know if they know what that means. Instead, you got to figure out a way to expose a gap in their understanding, a gap in their skill, and then it's a little bit of an aha type of moment. Oh, I guess I don't know as much as I thought, and that gets them back to engaging with the material in a way that may be more meaningful.
Yeah, yeah, I love that.
I hope that I'm happy to entertain more questions around that. I hope I'm answering that question in a way that is making sense and is actually right to the question.
No, I think so. And Ian did respond. Thank you. So he certainly got
Great.
value from your response. Another kind of related question from Ashley Heineken: are there certain technologies or software that enable people to learn more effectively or easily in a learner-controlled environment, especially with learning new types of software?
Okay, I got to think about that one a little bit. Thank you for that question. There probably are. I'll be honest. There are people working on that kind of stuff. I'm sure of it. And from a variety of disciplines. I'm not aware of any specific technologies, but I'm sure they're out there. But again, I'm sorry to just keep saying the same thing. But let's just remember, whatever that technology is, it's got to still be hitting those components of telling them, explaining to the learn that you got to have that in the learning environment. You got to have demonstrations. You got to have opportunities to practice. You have to have feedback that is letting people know a combination of what they're doing right, what they're doing well, very process based or behavioral based, action focused. And then, hey, these are some other things that you need to be working on. That's the negative or the constructive side. You got to have those combinations. So whatever technology's out there, hopefully it's enabling that process.
Yeah. Yeah, and it goes back to what we were talking a little bit about earlier with the utilization of AI, and how I'm hoping to see more technologies that's leveraging AI as that, live on the spot, feedback facilitator, to be able to, learn from the learner and give those nudges and give that directive, and not just saying explore more, but explicitly sharing how to explore more and how to further dig into those concepts. So I think there's a lot of really cool opportunities out there. It doesn't all have to be scary Terminator stuff. And one more question from the audience: what are some research finding highlights on learning development in a leader employee coaching context? And what are some ways that coachees learn even better in coaching context? So has any of your research delved into the coaching space, or do you see any sort of really good applications of this type of learner-centric active learning when it comes to coaching?
So I've not done any research on coaching. So I can only kind of talk about that more from personal experience as a coach of kids.
Mm-hmm.
So let me see that question again.
Sure,
I'm
absolutely.
hearing the question. Okay, what are some research finding highlights on learning and development in a coaching context? So I'm going to give you, I'll give you one. I feel like IO psychologists, the way we've approached giving feedback has been from I don't know, I'll say a control theory perspective, even if people aren't even using that explicitly in their brains. But the idea would be we need to what's the weakness? What are they not doing right? We need to give them feedback on that. We need to let them know, hey, they need to address this weakness. They need to be doing this better. That I think for a long time, our literature was really coming at things from a negative feedback's good. We have to have negative feedback. How are you supposed to get better if you're not getting exposed to what you're not doing well? And there's a lot of truth to that. But there is literature. I think a lot of it's coming more from developmental psychology, educational psychology. I've seen it in the sports psychology literature. And it's also true with me and coaching kids, is that sometimes as much as we're trying to help, hey, hold the bat this way. Hey, do it this way. Hey, you're not doing, whatever it is. When you're just getting all that negative feedback or that constructive, even if it's obvious it's coming from a good place and the person's being very pleasant and they're not critical of you as a person, and it's all behaviorally based. When you're just getting a lot of that negative feedback, I think the brain shuts down. We have some literature in the feedback performance management literature showing this. And one of the best times to give people negative feedback or constructive feedback is right after they've done something really well.
Mm.
I've found this personally with kids, that when they score that goal, when they hit the ball really hard, when they find the strike zone 3 times in a row, that's a time to praise them, what they're doing right. Yeah, you had your foot like this, you were doing this with your arm, you were really thinking, blah blah. And you know what? Here's another thing that you can add to what you just did. And it'll be like, okay, coach, okay, dad. But when you're just giving them that negative feedback when they're not doing so well, they'll shut down.
Yeah.
So I hope that answers the question, gives you something to chew on that you find interesting.
Yeah, it really highlights the importance of self-efficacy in learning and the importance of having those quick wins early on and being able to build upon that self-efficacy rather than just, going here's all the myriad of things that you need to still get better at.
Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting question for those who are looking to get more into the field. So, what do you recommend someone interested in learning development with no experience to break into the field? I have a strong talent acquisition background with communications and HR. What type of roles should I
Oh
pursue
boy.
to gain experience?
Okay, so whenever someone says, "Hey, that was a great question," that usually means that they're being stumped a little bit and nothing's coming to mind right off the bat, and they're just buying time to figure out a reasonably smart sounding answer. Let me see the question again. I'm not sure if I have any good advice here. Let me just see. Would you recommend someone what would you recommend development with no experience do to break into this field? I have a strong talent acquisition. So this is a I think you need to ask that question to other people. For one thing, my opinion isn't always going to be the best, or it's certainly going to be incomplete. You may want to just an entry place for this is maybe becoming a member of the Society for Training and Development.
Mm-hmm.
I think that might be a good way to kind of see what's happening, particularly from yeah, I'm in the world of academics. I don't do a lot of consulting. I'm more in the laboratory. But I think if you really want to come at it from a real world, what are the trends? What's going on? What are the industry recommendations? Those kinds of things. I think becoming a member of the American Society for Training and Development, or something similar to that, where you live, I think that would be a good place to kind of get started. Yeah.
Yeah, another recommendation would be if you attend the SIOP annual conference, see the learning track, the
Yeah.
content track for training, and attend those sessions. And not just attend them, but introduce yourselves to the panelists and find some like-minded individuals. And chances are you're going to find others in the room who are like you, looking to get more of that experience
And
and
ask questions, right?
ask questions.
Don't just go to the symposium, but ask a question.
Ask the question. I feel like that's the big key theme from our conversation
And
today.
and
Ask those
and if
questions.
you can't do it in this time of the symposium, go up to one of the presenters and ask them afterwards.
Yeah. I remember, as a grad student, I would sit in the chairs and look up at the panelists and the presenters and just in awe of how brilliant they were and how they had all these amazing things to say and this great research. And it doesn't take too long before that role switch and you're the
Yeah.
one that's on the stage, right? And so I think, just getting involved in the space, building your network, asking good questions. And before you know it, you might be the one sharing your expertise on training and development moving forward. I could talk about training and development all day with you, Eric, but unfortunately, that is all the time that we have. So, for those listening live, thank you so much for tuning in. And, Eric, on behalf of SIOP, all of our listeners, thank you for an engaging and enlightening conversation and for taking the time to speak with us today.
Well, thank you. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah,
I
we're so
really I
thrilled to
really
have.
enjoyed this. This was great, and thank you for the questions.
Of course. Thank you all for tuning in. Please join us for our next conversation on July 27th at 11:15 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you for joining today's conversation. We look forward to talking to you again soon. And until next time,